Hi, my name is Christina, and with Jackie, I'm going to present our paper, Subverting Machines, Fluctuating Identities. We hope to reshape and refine the way you think about identity with regards to socio-technical systems, whether in the form of a recommender system, optimizing to fulfill our desires, or a black box, arbitrating whether we get hired or approved. AI is becoming increasingly ubiquitous in our lives. These models that we interact with necessarily create some underlying notion of our identity, but AI research and related fairness practices renders identity as static and discrete and presumes that it captures some essential quality of being. We argue that this directly impedes how identity functions among people. For us, identity exists as relations that are constantly in flux, negotiations in eternal dialogue. The word identity has emerged as a shorthand for a cache of attributes to attach to people, race, gender, class, etc. But if we actually scrutinize the what of identity, we find that there is no fixed quality, consistent across all identifications, made by all people, across all time. I'll dig into this a bit deeper, introducing a theory of identity as a fluid, self-reinforcing network of relations, and substantiate it by drawing from scholars across critical theory. Jackie will then take us through a critique of AI fairness practices that strip away what is so useful about identity interpersonally. Finally, they'll talk about some technical schemas that might allow machines to conceive of identity more fluidly, and finish on an imaginary of what that might entail. If you're interested in further elaboration, please take a look at our paper or reach out. We can best understand identity as an action, to identify. Identification is a process of superimposing layers of fantasy. Your fantasy, their fantasy, your fantasy of their fantasy of yours. These sediment into collective categorizations in overlapping dialogue, settling into cultural intelligibility. Trying to unearth the what of identification reveals a collapsing recursion. What we recognize as identity substance is itself a product of unfurling fantasies of what identity might consist of. Two biologists introduced the term autopoiesis to describe a network of processes that is capable of reproducing and maintaining itself in order to capture the self-contained chemistry of living cells. Such a system continuously regenerates its own components and organization, realizing the very processes that produce them. We apply this term to understand identity as an autopoietic system, foregrounding the self-reinforcing circularity and perpetual motion of its processes. These processes are roughly reducible to function, how identity is used, internally and interpersonally, and construction, how it is formed, discursively and psychically. One informs the other, constituting each other's parts. The two can be co-located within the same social interaction. This structure reveals how identity is capable of evolving, as it is constituted of feedback loops, perturbing any norm in how identity is constructed or functions, cascades across the network. Social drift is possible. The machine learning abstraction of identity, however, is unidirectional, fully constructing identity based on its function. This immobilizes the way identity can evolve and therefore mobilizes concurrent power hierarchies. Drawing from theorists such as Judith Butler, Stuart Hall, Karen Barad, and Jasbir Kapoor, we substantiate and clarify this theory of autopoietic identity. It is crucial to foreground the many contradictions inherent to discussing identity. One is around the desire to presume a unitary subject as the basis of solidarity, such as within feminism. Butler claims that this is actually antithetical to any liberatory aims. The usefulness of such a category is actually precluded by the normative prescriptions it makes and the negative foreclosure implied by any variation of its definition. Another contradiction is within the imperfect attachments required to hold identity together inside yourself. To Hall, one's identity is, quote, increasingly fragmented and fractured, multiply constructed across different and often intersecting and antagonistic discourses, practices, and positions. We're required to articulate the point of suture between the discourses and practices which fix us as subjects, and the processes which allow us to speak. We attach ourselves to discursive identity concepts and signifiers, while contending with the fact that they will always be inadequate representations. We also have to figure out how to fit materiality into this system, because of course there are material effects at play. Precisely because identity is constructed discursively means that we must understand the historical and political institutions through which it emerges. Categorization is ambivalent. There is nothing inherently harmful about this process, but it necessarily reinforces one point of view and erases another. Boker and Starr argue that to classify is human. There are classifications formalized through institutions and ad hoc ones that are tacit in our minds. Rather than dispel categories entirely, we must scrutinize the structures that create and maintain their forms. Here, I introduce Barad's agential realist framework, which construes phenomena as the primary ontological unit and stipulates that all entities only exist via interaction. Within this graph of interaction, cuts can be temporarily made to enact a local resolution. The discursive practices which produce these cuts are specific acts of boundary making, which permit intelligibility, but nevertheless make no claim to the dynamic whole. The issue is, when algorithms produce such a cut to make sense of identity, they tacitly assume both a fixed material and a deterministic way of handling it. Instead, such models should assume that their purpose, in fact, constructs any underpinning materiality. This all leads us to understand identity, not only as an event, but as an iterative event. Poore uses the concept of assemblage from Deleuze and Guattari, which, quote, foregrounds no constants, but rather variation to variation, and hence the eventness of identity. This de-emphasizes the subject and allows a sensitive analysis of power and affect layered within each interaction. Extending this, Butler clarifies their notion of performativity by highlighting that performance is not a singular event, but rather a ritualized production reiterated under constraint. The most critical point here is the recursive element, the immediate feedback loop. Identity always occurs with a response which restrains and modifies it. During identification, you take on certain prescriptions and aspire to others. This iterative process means you enforce and destabilize the very identity concepts you interact with. This is the fundamental distinction between how AI works in humans and AI models. Among humans, the subversion of identities, and indeed all conscious or unconscious enactments, means that any conceived identity is forever in flux. All emergent categories can be eroded and take on new forms. In contrast, the strict referent form of identity in AI means that how a machine conceives of identity cannot evolve or iterate or be subverted. Instead, it immobilizes extant identity concepts and the hierarchies that co-occur.
While the autopoietic system of identity has a circular and fluid nature, machine learning systems conceptualize it as unidirectional and static. Technical AI fairness solutions make a well-intentioned attempt to mitigate bias and enforce equality, but their abstraction of identity as discrete, static, and essential forms a precarious foundation for justice. Most AI systems assume identity categories are discrete buckets, but many identities are on a spectrum, allowing gradations of difference, such as gender and sexuality, or racial categories, which are a multidimensional spectrum of phenotype, internal, and external identification. The discrete assumption may be encoded in the dataset, or it may be a limitation of the model. For example, classification algorithms can only output discrete categories, in contrast to regression, which outputs a continuous value. The potential harms of this assumption include identity erasure, inaccurate statistics, and a failure to serve individuals on the boundary of categorization. An alternative is to represent identity markers as floating point numbers, but this doesn't illustrate how the form and relevance of an identity is highly dynamic and depends on context. AI systems usually represent identity categories as having fixed or static values per individual. But identity markers vary across time and context because identity is an iterative event. We situationally activate facets of our identity to relate or to differentiate from others. For example, the phenomenon of code switching between accents and dialects. Counterfactual fairness is sometimes proposed as a way of inferring causes from contextual variables. However, causal inference intervenes by varying identity markers across individuals and not within a certain individual. Machine learning has the tools for context sensitivity, such as RNNs and transformers, but practitioners have not yet deployed it for fluid identity. Even if identity signifiers are permitted to be contextual, they are often imposed by a set of unquestioned and unspoken cultural assumptions, which the system treats as ground truth. Machine learning systems often assume the signifiers in the dataset reflect inherent properties of the entities represented. The idea that measurable characteristics wholly determine a person's essence is also called essentialism. In contrast, co-construction is the idea that identity is socially constructed via the cyclic interaction of an individual's actions and interpretation of reality with others. Essentialist systems inherit the colonial Cartesian Eurocentric tradition in statistics and data science. Recent works cited in our paper question this paradigm in machine learning, investigating the provenance of power in identity categories, and considering the risks of enforcing algorithmic fairness across hegemonically constructed categories. Despite these critiques, essentialist assumptions in machine learning still prevail. In a field that claims to make objective conclusions, endowing our systems with fluidity and subjectivity is difficult, but not impossible. Some critics of machine learning claim that the discipline is fundamentally at odds with the ambiguity of human behavior. We acknowledge that machine learning systems have epistemic limits to understanding identity, just like we do. But we already interact with algorithms that try to understand our identity on a daily basis. We need better, if still imperfect, paradigms for identity learning. So, we'll take a creative turn to imagine alternative configurations for identity in machine learning systems. First, we'll ask if there's a better computational model for the cycle of construction and function, focusing on bi-level or multi-level optimization, where one function is optimized with respect to another learned function. Two popular frameworks in this family are generative adversarial networks, or GANs, and actor-critic algorithms. To utilize GANs for identity, we can optimize a generator to produce adversarial samples to fool an identity discriminator, and the generator then will produce samples that defy categorization. However, this approach still centers fixed identity labels as the ground truth, to which optimization converges. In the actor-critic setting, an agent learns a policy to maximize its value function, a learned approximation of the sum of discounted expected rewards. Consider a setting where the policy operates on mutable identity characteristics and acts of identification. The critic then learns the utility of these actions in the value function, an approximation of the task-specific external reward. While this better illustrates the shifting constructed nature of identity, the external reward function opens up another Pandora's box of epistemological problems, which we leave for future work. Better models only go so far without better datasets. Datasets encode cultural and political values, like the Cartesian essentialism typical in machine learning. But we exist in a relational network of complex social connections, where each node represents a different point of view. Thus, we propose a relational process for human identity dataset collection with free-form text, where each participant self-describes, then describes every other participant or a large representative sample based on measurable characteristics. Then, any model trained on this data can be conditioned on self-identified properties, enabling shifting perspectives on the same entities. This method may empower each individual's point of view within the dataset, but without the inclusion of marginalized voices typically underrepresented in the field, this dataset would only enforce the hegemonic forces at play in dataset production. If these technical mechanisms can close the gap in identity formation, what are the implications for society? We propose an imaginary of intra-system interplay, where machines enter the identity construction function feedback loop. If a machine can realize the malleable, iterative, circular properties of identity, it can also destabilize and expand identity concepts. What would that cause at a societal scale? What possibilities are unleashed when machine learning systems are no longer adversarial enforcers of identity categories? What would a machine assemblage of co-constructed cyber identities look like? Machines could reveal new identity configurations and methods of subversion, reshaping how we relate to each other and ourselves. This may sound like speculative fiction, but don't forget, identity is part fiction too. We're really excited to discuss this work with you. Thank you for listening.